Full Stack Basics presents Master JavaScript. Unlock the power behind the frameworks.
Welcome to the final truth for this series. Truth number 10. You don't need a framework to create interactive features. Mastering JavaScript fundamentals empowers you to build dynamic experience without the overhead. And we are going to learn that because in this episode, we are going to get started with drag and drop. So let's meet over at VS Code. Back to VS Code, I created a new folder called DevTruths, drag and drop, vanilla.js, which I included in my DevTruths projects folder. So let's get started quickly. Create a style.css. And in here, we're going to include styling for the container, pause and implement. For the draggable items, pause and implement. And for the drop zone, which is where we're going to drop the draggable items. So please pause and implement this. Now, we're going to create our index.html. And in here, I am simply going to implement the bare bones HTML that we're going to use for this episode. First, I'm going to create the bare bones HTML, and then I'm going to update it with what we need. First thing I'm going to update is the head with the link to the style sheet and a new title. Then in the body, I'm going to include a div of class container, and inside of the container, I'm going to include 2 draggable items, and then I'm going to include 2 drop zones. So since we're talking drag and drop, it is very clear what we're doing here. A draggable item is what you're going to be dragging around, and the drop zone is where you are allowed to drop items to. Pause and implement. Now, in here in the body, let's go ahead and point our index.html to the script called app.js, which we're going to create right now. So make sure that your index.html looks like mine. So let's go ahead and work on the JavaScript side of things. The first thing is that you have to pick your targets. We need to make sure that we have control over everything that is draggable and the drop zones. So make sure that you create these variables. Then we need to make sure that we actually handle things when we start dragging. So in here, what I'm going to do is get all the draggables, and we're going to iterate through each by using for each. Now, for each draggable, we're going to do the following. So include the arrow and the set of curly braces here. Pause and implement. So each draggable, we are going to add an event listener to, because here we're listening for the drag start event. Then once that starts, we're going to take the event as a parameter here. We're going to put an arrow function here and make some room. Pause and implement. And then basically what we want to do is for that specific event, we are going to do the data transfer, and we're going to set the data to text plain and then the draggable ID, because we're going to need that later. I'm going to save to reformat, make sure that this is implemented correctly. Next thing we want to do is actually iterate through the drop zones. And each drop zone is a specific zone here. And we're going to put an arrow function so that we can then add event listeners for the drag over and the drop events. So for the zone in question, we're going to first add that event listener for the drag over. So this is when we're dragging over that specific zone. And then when that happens, we are going to include an arrow function that takes the event as a parameter. Pause and implement. When we're dragging over, all we want to do is prevent the default behavior. Pause and implement. Then the other event listener that we want in the drop zones is the drop event, which is when we are finishing our drag and dropping, right? And again, we are going to include another arrow function that takes the event as a parameter. And the first thing that we want to do, which I'm going to copy from up here, is to prevent the default behavior. Then we want to get the ID, pause and implement. And then we want to get the draggable item. And we're going to use the ID to then get the element by ID, pause and implement. And lastly, when we're dropping, what we want to do is actually append the draggable item to that specific zone. Pause and implement. Now with this done, I'm going to open this in Live Server and meet me over at the browser. Over at the browser, you can see that we have a perfect starting project for anyone who wants to learn drag and drop from scratch. So here we have the draggable items and we have the drop zones. So we can grab the item and actually drop it in the drop zone and it will actually stay there. And you can move it from one drop zone to another. But of course, you cannot drop it anywhere else because we only have 2 drop zones and 2 items. And what have you done here? You have created interactivity without using any frameworks. And this is very valuable because if you use libraries in a specific framework, React, Angular, Vue, if for whatever reason that library goes out of support, which happens all the time, you know what to do. You know how these things work under the hood. Perfect. So why don't we go ahead and do the same with React? Let's create a new React project in your DevTruths projects folder. So for this, I'm going to use the vite command that we have been using throughout this series. The only difference is that now we're creating the DevTruths drag and drop React project. Hit enter and then open that project which got created right here with VS Code. Now that we have the project here, let's do the same cleanup we always do with these React projects. Actually, I would like to challenge you to do it on your own, but you can follow along here. First, npm install to get all the dependencies so we can actually run our project. I'm going to get rid of everything in index.css. I'm going to get rid of everything in app.css. And then I'm going to include the following styling. We're going to start with the container. And again, we're only working right now with draggable and drop zone. So let me close this here so that you can see everything and pause and implement. Now let's go ahead and actually clean up our app.jsx. We know what to do here. Let's get rid of everything that comes with the boilerplate project, and your app.jsx should look like mine. In the function app, we're going to include a list of items, and these are going to be the draggable items. So it's a list, and it's initialized with useState, and this useState has a list with 2 objects, drag1 and drag2. Pause and implement. We're going to now do the same with the zones. Pause and implement. With this done, then we want to take care of the drag start event, which is fairly simple. We're going to create a function on drag start that takes the event and the item ID, and then it says the data transfer like so. Pause and implement. We want to handle the event when we are dragging over. And for this, we're going to create this function here on drag over. Takes the event as a parameter and prevent defaults. This is required to allow for dropping. Pause and implement. So now that we are handling the drag start and the drag over, the next thing we have to handle is the drop. And here, we're going to include an arrow function that takes the event and the target zone as parameters. Then I'm going to put here the arrow and curly braces. Pause and implement. What we're going to do here is prevent default and get the item ID. Pause and implement. Then what we're going to do is set the zones. So include that keyword here, open a set of brackets, and then use the keyword previous for previous zone. Then we're going to include the arrow here and a set of curly braces. And then we're going to open this up so that we can do some work. Pause and implement. We're going to then include any new zones. And for this, we're going to use the spread operator. Pause and implement. Then under here, we want to remove the item from any zone it's currently in. So I'm going to make some room so that you know that we're still working inside of here. Pause and implement this code. And lastly, we want to add the item to the new zone, and then we want to return the new zones. Pause and implement. Next thing we're going to do is simply minimize the drop, minimize the drag over, just minimize a few things here, because then what we want to do is create the render zone. So for this, I'm going to create an arrow function called render zone. I'm going to include two parameters here, the zone key and the title. And then we're going to obviously finish up our arrow function. But this time around, instead of curly braces, I want you to include brackets. Pause and implement. So the first thing we're going to do here is include a div. This div will have the class name of drop zone, and then on drag over, it calls the drag over function that we created. And then on drop, of course, it calls the drop function that we created. And I do have a small typo here because this drop function that we created, we need to call it on drop. This one right here. So make sure that that matches. Pause and implement. Now that you have that done, we're going to open some room here in the div, and we're going to create the title like so. And then under the title, we're going to include a set of curly braces. I'm going to make some room, pause and implement this. And then what we want to do is map through the zones using the zone key. We're going to, like I said, map here. I'm going to include a set of brackets, pause and implement. We're going to get the item ID, and then we're going to set the arrow and a set of curly braces like so. Pause and implement. Then what we want to do here is actually identify the item. And for this, we're going to get all the items, and we're going to try and find it by the ID. Pause and implement. I'm going to save this just to reformat, but we're still working inside of those curly braces. So I'm going to make some room right under the item here. And I'm going to include a return statement with brackets. Pause and implement. And then what this really returns is the following. We're going to have a div here, and let me close it down so that it doesn't complain. And this div has the ID of the item ID, the class name of draggable, and obviously it calls it on drag start. Pause and implement. And then obviously in the middle here, in between the div, we have the item content. Pause and implement. Let's go ahead and finish this up, because now that we have this render zone here, all done, I'm going to minimize it. And in the return function here, all we have to do is include brackets. We can keep the fragment here, and I'm just going to make some room. And then all we have to do is include a div with class container. And inside here, we're going to include a render zone for the available items. Then I'm going to include a render zone for zone 1, and then a render zone for drop zone 2. Please pause and implement this. With this done, you can go ahead and run your server and meet me over at the browser. Over at the browser, as you can see for React, I did something a bit different. I wanted to show you also a way to have available items. Now, what I like about this is that it mimics a lot what a Kanban board would look like in real life. So you already know the core basics of how drag and drop would work. And if you want to learn to build something like this, be sure to check our full stack JavaScript bundle.
This premium content is brought to you by Full Stack Basics JavaScript Bundle. Learn more at fullstackbasics.io/projects.
Back to our test. As you can see, I can actually drag items to drop zones and move them however I want. And as you can see here, available items is also a drop zone. This is it. These are 10 truths that prove to you that it's important to actually be able to build single-page applications with vanilla JavaScript. Now, what's next? Well, stay tuned, because in the next 30 seconds, I'm going to tell you what your next step could be.
This premium content is brought to you by Full Stack Basics JavaScript Bundle. Create a full-stack Kanban board prototype with Vanilla.js and the Gem stack, including registration, login, and drag-and-drop functionality without libraries. Next, create a production-ready Kanban board with the Mern stack, including Google Single Sign-On and drag-and-drop. Learn more at fullstackbasics.io/projects.